A 14-year-old black boy, Elijah Carter, sat in the VIP section of a packed stadium, feeling the rare weight of privilege on his shoulders. The ticket, a last-minute gift from his uncle, a groundskeeper at the stadium, was a small glimpse into a world that rarely welcomed boys like him. He felt the soft fabric of the plush seat beneath him, the thrill of being so close to the action, but also the quiet, gnawing anxiety that someone might tap him on the shoulder and tell him he didn't belong. Then he saw her, a pregnant woman, standing near the aisle, shifting uncomfortably as the crowd swayed with excitement. Her hand rested on her stomach, her face lined with exhaustion. Elijah glanced around. Every seat was filled except his. In that moment, his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Be the reason someone believes in the goodness of people. So, without hesitation, Elijah stood up, weaving through the crowded rows to approach her. Ma'am, he said, voice steady but nervous. You can take my seat. It's a VIP seat. Real close to the field. You need it more than I do. At first, she hesitated, surprise flickering across her face. Then, with tears brimming in her eyes, she thanked him and took the seat. A murmur of approval rippled through the nearby spectators. An older man gave Elijah an approving nod. Good kid, he muttered. Elijah didn't think much of it. He found another seat in the upper levels, far from the polished comforts of VIP. He watched the game from a distance, content in the quiet pride of having done the right thing. But what happened next shocked everyone. The pregnant woman, Natalie Reyes, wasn't just any spectator. She was the daughter-in-law of the billionaire who owned the stadium. And within 48 hours, Elijah's act of kindness set off a chain of events no one saw coming. What unfolded next would challenge the very structures of power and privilege in ways he could never have imagined. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to follow for more. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples. The stadium was alive with a roar that rumbled through the steel beams and concrete steps. A pulse of voices rising in anticipation of the game. The scent of popcorn and sweat hung thick in the late afternoon air, mingling with the sharp tang of freshly cut turf. It was the kind of night that made people forget themselves, surrendering to the sheer force of competition, of belonging. And yet, Elijah Carter sat stiff-backed in his VIP seat, his hands gripping the plush armrests as though they might vanish beneath his touch. The weight of the moment pressed on him, not just the surreal joy of sitting so close to the field, but the quiet, insidious sense that he did not belong. Elijah was 14, lean with sharp eyes that took in the world in a way that made adults uneasy. His mother always said he had an old soul, but what she really meant was that he had already learned too much about the world. He had learned that being black meant being watched, that walking into the wrong neighborhood could mean suspicion, that sitting in a seat like this one, usually reserved for the city's wealthiest patrons, meant he was something to be questioned. His uncle, a groundskeeper at the stadium, had handed him the ticket just that afternoon, his face lined with a weary sort of pride. Got lucky today, kid. Some rich man backed out at the last minute. Don't waste it. So here he was, in a place where black boys like him were rarely seen unless they wore jerseys and ran plays on the field. Elijah tried to quiet the unease gnawing at him, focusing on the field where the players were warming up. He could almost forget himself in the sight of them, the way they moved. Powerful and effortless, a perfect choreography of bodies colliding and leaping in defiance of gravity. Then he saw her. A woman, white, mid-30s, stood near the aisle a few rows back, her hand resting against the swell of her pregnant belly. She shifted from foot to foot, her face drawn with exhaustion. Her eyes scanned the crowd, seeking a seat that wasn't there. Elijah turned his head, expecting someone, an usher, a stadium official, another fan to step in, to offer a place. But no one moved. People noticed her, that much was clear. But they looked away just as quickly, feigning distraction. He should have done the same. He should have sat back in his seat, stared straight ahead, let the moment pass. Instead, he stood. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even brave. It was instinct. Ma'am, he said, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped toward her. You can take my seat. Her eyes snapped to him, wide with surprise. For a moment, she just stared. "Oh," she said, flustered. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." Elijah shrugged. "It's fine. You need it more." It was simple, or at least, it should have been. But the moment stretched, an invisible thread of tension pulling tight between them. A hush spread through the nearby seats. Just enough for Elijah to feel it. Just enough for him to know that what he had done was not simply an act of kindness, but something else entirely. A test. Would she take the seat? Would she accept a favor from someone like him? The hesitation lasted only a breath. But in that breath, Elijah felt the weight of history pressing down on them both. The legacy of buses where people like him were told to stand. Of counters where they were told they could not sit. Of places, always places, where they were made to feel like they were intruding. Then, as if she understood, she reached for his arm lightly, briefly before lowering herself into the seat. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling with something Elijah couldn't quite place. A murmur rippled through the section. A man nearby gave a small nod. "Nice of you, kid." Others simply stared. Elijah turned away before he could see more. Weaving through the crowd toward the upper sections, he found a spot in the nosebleeds, where the field stretched far and small beneath him. The players little more than specks in a blur of motion. His chest felt tight. He told himself it was fine. But something about the moment had shifted. Something about the way the crowd had watched him. He didn't think about it again, at least. Not in a way that felt important until 2 nights later, when his mother answered the phone and her face went still. "Yes," Lorraine said, her fingers tightening around the receiver. "He's my son." A pause. A breath. "Is something wrong?" Elijah sat at the table, his heart pounding, his fingers tightening around his pencil. Had he done something wrong? Had there been some unspoken rule he had broken? His mother's eyes flicked to him, searching his face as though looking for an answer neither of them had. When she hung up, her hand trembled slightly as she pressed it to her cheek. "That was the stadium," she said, her voice quiet. "They want to meet you." Elijah blinked. "Meet me?" Lorraine's expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes was sharp. Wary. "They said it's about what happened at the game," she said carefully. "About the woman you gave your seat to." And just like that, the simple act, the small kindness, the thing he had done without thought became something else. Something bigger. Something neither of them understood yet. And for the first time, Elijah felt a quiet, creeping fear. The next morning arrived with a chill that cut through Elijah's already trembling spirit. In the quiet light of early dawn, he sat at the kitchen table, a worn paperback open before him but unread, his thoughts too heavy to turn the pages. The echo of the previous evening's stadium, where every whisper and sideways glance had felt like a judgment, pulsed in his veins. His act of kindness, a simple offer, a small seat exchanged, had unexpectedly stirred forces he had never imagined. That same morning, the phone rang again. This time, it was his mother, Lorraine, her voice softer than usual, layered with concern. "Elijah," she began, hesitating before continuing, "they're asking us to come down to the stadium's administrative offices. It's about what happened at the game." Her words tumbled into him, each syllable weighted with an unspoken significance. The idea of being summoned by the powers that governed the space he had so briefly trespassed in unsettled him deeply. It was as if his quiet, uncalculated act had rippled outward into realms of power and prejudice, a collision between his own innocence and a system built to contain him. In the slow march to the stadium that day, every step felt charged, as if the pavement itself remembered the echoes of his footsteps the night before. He rode the bus with his mother, his gaze fixed out the window at passing houses and quiet neighborhoods, each a silent witness to histories of hardship and triumph, of segregated dreams and unspoken resentments. The bus rumbled along, punctuating his mounting anxiety with each clack over the bumps in the road. When they arrived, the grand facade of the stadium loomed before him, a monument to American ambition and its contradictions. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of polished wood and over-enthusiastic ambition. At the reception desk, an assistant with clipped manners and an impassive expression took their names. her eyes briefly lingering on Elijah's youthful face before dismissing him as just another anomaly in the day's schedule. Soon, they were led into a spacious office where sunlight streamed through tall, narrow windows. Seated behind a desk of dark mahogany was Gregory Langston, the public relations manager, whose measured smile could not quite hide the glimmer of calculation in his eyes. As he began to speak, his words were calm and measured, but each one carried an undercurrent that made Elijah's skin crawl. "Mr. Carter," Gregory said, pronouncing the boy's last name with a formal weight that bordered on irony. "We have been made aware of your act of kindness at last night's game." His tone was neither accusatory nor effusive, it was simply stated, as if the incident were a statistic in an annual report, not a human gesture born of compassion. Elijah's heart pounded as he struggled to find his voice. He had expected something, perhaps a reprimand for breaking an unwritten code, or praise for the selfless act. Instead, he found himself caught in a limbo of silence, his answer reduced to a single, soft murmur. I did what felt right." Gregory's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the tension in the room thickened. "You see," he continued slowly, "in our community, in this stadium, there exists a certain order, a structure that is designed to maintain the status quo. Your actions, though well-intentioned, disrupt that order." There was a pause as if he were weighing every word. "We understand that you did not intend any harm. But there are implications here beyond the simple act of generosity. It has drawn attention." Attention. Elijah's mind raced back to the hushed murmurs in the VIP section, to the scrutinizing looks that had lingered on him as he walked away. The idea that his quiet dignity had been seen not merely as kindness, but as a defiant statement against a system steeped in a legacy of racial prejudice, sent a chill through him. Outside the office, Lorraine's hand trembled around his as they were escorted to the exit. Her eyes, so often soft with maternal love, now shone with a mix of worry and resignation. "They're not saying you did anything wrong, Elijah," she whispered, "but sometimes doing what is right means you must face questions you did not ask." As they stepped back into the blinding light of the afternoon, the stadium's walls seemed to close in, laden with the weight of history. The air itself felt heavy with unspoken rules and memories of bus rides where black bodies were expected to yield, where a simple act of taking a seat could mark you as different. Every step he took resonated with the quiet power of resistance and the stark, painful reality that resistance, even when born of kindness, carried a cost. In that moment, Elijah sensed that his world was about to change in ways he could scarcely imagine. The gentle act that had come so naturally was now an ignition, a spark in a tinderbox of everyday injustice. His path was no longer the quiet avenue of childhood. It had transformed into a corridor fraught with questions about identity, belonging, and the persistent, simmering anger of a society that too often placed limits on a black boy's dreams. And so, as he walked home that day with his mother, the streets hummed with a tension that was both old and new, a cadence that spoke of a struggle as relentless as it was unseen. The stadium had become a mirror, reflecting the deep divides and silent battles fought in every corner of America. For Elijah, every step was now a testament to the promise that, even in the face of systemic prejudice, one act of kindness could ripple outward to challenge a broken order. It was the beginning of something profound, a journey where the simple truth of doing what is right would confront the long shadows of racism, exposing not only the fractures in the fabric of society, but also the enduring hope that change was possible, even for a boy who simply dared to give up his seat. In the days that followed the office meeting, Elijah's life became a quiet battlefield of introspection and everyday encounters, each one revealing the unyielding undercurrent of racial prejudice that he had so often felt but rarely named. The early morning light carried with it the soft promise of another day. Yet beneath its gentle glow, Elijah sensed that every step was measured against a ledger of unspoken expectations. That morning, as he walked to school along cracked sidewalks lined with faded murals of civil rights heroes, the hush of the neighborhood was punctuated by murmurs, neighbors greeting him in tones that veered between warmth and wary reserve. For some, his presence was a reminder of battles fought long ago. For others, an uneasy sign that change was stirring in a place where the rules were so firmly set in stone. At school, the hallways echoed with whispers that were both kind and cruel. A teacher, with decades behind him and eyes that had witnessed the slow unraveling of an era, pulled Elijah aside. "Son, I heard about what happened at the game," he said in a low, measured voice that trembled between pride and concern. "Your heart's in the right place. But this world, it's not kind to those who step out of line." His words were gentle, yet they carried the weight of experience, years spent watching hopeful souls be trampled by a system that demanded quiet submission. Elijah nodded, feeling the sting of that truth. He had always believed that doing the right thing would lead to a better future. But now, each step toward that future was littered with obstacles. The subtle glances of classmates, the whispered comments in corners, and the pervasive feeling that his very existence was a statement against a history built on exclusion. All these weighed on him with growing intensity. That afternoon, the tension reached a fever pitch when, after school, Elijah found himself accosted by a group of boys from a neighboring block. They had known him from the whispers and the headlines, the boy who had given up his VIP seat, the symbol of a kindness that dared to disturb the established order. Under the shade of an old oak tree, their voices, though low, were charged with an edge that left no room for misunderstanding. "Hey, Carter," one sneered, using his last name as if it were a taunt. "Think you're better than us now? Huh? Going around playing the hero?" Another, his tone laced with bitterness, added, "What's next? Gonna tell us we all should change just 'cause you did one nice thing?" Elijah's stomach twisted as he searched for words that might bridge the gap between his quiet resolve and their bristling anger. He felt the sting of being singled out not for what he had done, but for who he was. In their eyes, he was a constant reminder of the boundaries drawn by a society that had never intended for him to cross them. Before the situation could escalate further, a familiar voice broke through the tension. Mr. Henderson, a man whose lined face bore the scars of decades in a segregated world, intervened. "Boys, that's enough," he said sternly, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had seen the worst and the best of his community. Elijah's act was nothing but an act of compassion. We ought to be learning from it, not using it as an excuse to wound one another. Yet even as Mr. Henderson's words echoed in the stillness, Elijah could sense that the damage had been done. The casual cruelty of prejudice hidden behind jokes and bitter banter was a reminder that kindness, no matter how genuine, could never be isolated from the larger struggles that plagued their society. That evening, as twilight deepened the shadows on his neighborhood's weathered facades, Elijah returned home with a heart heavier than the day before. The events of the day had converged into a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, pride in his own decency, and a dawning realization of the cost that such decency demanded in a world unwilling to change. His mother, Lorraine, noticed the silent storm brewing behind his eyes as they sat together in the modest living room. "Sometimes, baby, doing what's right puts you in the crosshairs of those who fear change," she murmured, her voice soft with years of hard-won wisdom. "But you must know, every time you stand up, you're shaking the very foundation of a system that's built on exclusion. That is something they cannot ignore." Her words, laden with both sorrow and hope, stoked a flicker within him. The simple act of giving up a seat had grown into an inescapable symbol of defiance, a spark in a tinderbox of lingering resentment and institutional bias. Now, every public interaction, every sideways glance, and every whispered word carried with it the realization that his life was no longer just his own. He had become an unwitting ambassador of a truth that was as old as the struggle for equality itself. In the quiet aftermath of that night, as the clock ticked into the early hours, Elijah lay awake on his thin mattress, the silence punctuated by the distant hum of a city that never forgot its history. His mind raced with visions of future confrontations, of meetings with those in power who would challenge him, and of moments when his resolve would be tested in ways he could scarcely imagine. Yet, amid the mounting challenges, there remained a fierce, unyielding hope, a conviction that even the smallest acts of kindness could ignite a revolution of the heart. Thus, as the night deepened, so too did his understanding, that the battle for dignity was not fought in grand gestures alone, but in the quiet, relentless courage of everyday choices. and though the world around him was growing ever more tense and unforgiving, Elijah's spirit, tempered by both hardship and compassion, was ready to meet it head-on. One determined step at a time. In the days that followed the painful confrontation beneath that ancient oak, Elijah's world began to constrict with an ever-deepening sense of inevitability. Each morning, as he trudged to school along streets steeped in history and hardship, the whispers of the past of segregated buses and silent corridors mingled with the present, creating a cadence of sorrow and quiet defiance that echoed in his very bones. That morning, the sun rose timidly over rows of worn houses, their stoops harboring memories of a time when being black in America meant contending with the explicit cruelty of injustice. Now, even in a day as ordinary as any other, Elijah sensed that the weight of that history pressed against him with relentless insistence. His heart pounded as he recalled the hushed cruelty of his peers, the bitter laughter that had followed him down the hallways after the incident at the stadium. At school, his teacher, Mr. Daniels, a man whose lined face bore the testimony of decades fighting a quiet war against systemic injustice, invited him to stay after class. The classroom, with its walls adorned by faded portraits of heroes from a bygone era, suddenly felt like a confessional. "Elijah," Mr. Daniels said softly, leaning forward with a seriousness that brooked no misunderstanding. "You did something remarkable at the game. But in our society, every act of kindness by a black boy is scrutinized, dissected, and used to further the divide." His eyes, moist with both regret and resolve, searched Elijah's face. "You must understand, my son, that the cost of doing what is right is often paid in the currency of pain." Elijah nodded, feeling the truth of those words burn into him. It wasn't enough to simply act with goodness. His very act was now a battleground where the past and the present collided. And as he left the classroom, the corridors seemed to whisper of a destiny that was larger and harsher than he had ever imagined. That afternoon, the tension in the air coalesced into something tangible when he encountered Mr. Jenkins, the proprietor of a small corner store that had long served as a gathering place for the neighborhood's elders. Mr. Jenkins, with his gruff voice softened by years of hard living, eyed Elijah with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Boy," he said slowly, "every time one of you stands up for what's right, it shakes the foundation of this old world. But don't you forget, this country wasn't built for a boy like you to walk so freely." His words, half warning and half benediction, left Elijah with a heavy heart, as if the store itself, cluttered with relics of the past, was mourning the loss of innocence. Even as Elijah grappled with these daily confrontations, the reverberations of his stadium deed were reaching places he could neither anticipate nor control. That evening, a letter arrived at his modest home, its envelope stiff and official, a summons from the local chapter of a civic organization that prided itself on community improvement. The letter congratulated him on his act of kindness. Yet beneath the congratulatory language lurked a disquieting caveat, an invitation to speak at a community forum on bridging social divides. His mother, Lorraine, read the letter aloud, her voice wavering between pride and anxiety. "They want you to be a symbol, Elijah," she whispered, "but symbols are double-edged, and they don't always serve the people they're meant to uplift." Her words clung to him throughout the night, as he lay awake on his thin mattress, the ceiling a patchwork of shadows that danced to the rhythm of a troubled heart. The invitation, intended as an honor, now loomed as a burden, a demand that his quiet act of decency be transformed into a spectacle for those who would either celebrate or exploit his difference. The next day, at the forum held in a town hall whose wooden seats creaked under the weight of accumulated memories, the air was thick with expectation. The audience, a tapestry of local elders whose lives had been shaped by decades of exclusion and marginalization, regarded him with a mixture of reverence and caution. Among them sat Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who had witnessed the rise and fall of civil rights movements and carried scars of a past where even a smile from a black child could ignite fury in white hearts. Elijah took the stage with trembling resolve. His voice, when it emerged, was soft at first, as if testing the space between himself and the listeners. "I gave up my seat," he began, each word measured and heavy with the weight of unspoken history, "because I believe that kindness could be a bridge, a way to remind us that Despite our differences, we share a common humanity. For a brief, charged moment, silence fell over the room, a silence that spoke of hope and latent resentment alike. But then, from the back of the hall, a bitter remark sliced through the stillness. "A bridge, huh?" a voice scoffed. "More like a reminder that our world isn't ready for a black boy's kindness." The murmurs that followed were a low hum of discontent, a counterpoint to his message. Elijah's heart thundered in his ears as he searched the sea of faces for understanding. Some eyes were soft with regret, others were hard, guarding ancient prejudices that had no place in polite conversation, yet were impossible to extinguish. The forum spiraled into an exchange of voices, some calling for unity, others for caution, and a few, unashamedly, for a return to the old order. The tension mounted, rising like a tide that threatened to overwhelm the delicate hope of change. And as Elijah stood there, confronted with the raw, painful reality of a society still deeply divided by race, he felt the full weight of an inheritance he had neither chosen nor fully understood. In that charged atmosphere, every word was an act of defiance against the systemic injustice that had defined his community for generations. Every breath he took was a quiet protest against a world unwilling to let him and those like him stand tall without a cost. As the forum ended in a cacophony of voices and shifting alliances, Elijah stepped off the stage with a heavy heart. The journey ahead was no longer just about a single act of kindness. It was about the enduring struggle for dignity in a nation that had yet to reckon with the ghosts of its past. And in that struggle, every challenge was a step toward a future that, for all its pain and tension, carried the faint promise of redemption. That morning, the sky was an uncertain gray. As though it too hesitated to witness what was to come, Elijah awoke with a disquiet that had no name, a foreboding that had been building slowly, like a tide rising beneath the surface of a quiet sea. He dressed in the modest clothes of his everyday life, each piece a reminder that he was a boy born into a legacy of both hope and relentless struggle. But today, every step he took felt as if it were measured against an invisible scale of judgment. Every heartbeat echoing the heavy cost of daring to be kind in a world so intent on cruelty. On the bus ride to school, the murmurs of his neighbors fused with the engine's hum. The city, with its cracked sidewalks and towering apartment blocks, seemed to pulse with memories of a past riddled with segregation, of days when a black child's mere presence was an act of rebellion. The older passengers, whose eyes had seen decades of change yet remained wary of progress, exchanged glances that carried both pity and caution. They remembered too well the price paid by those who dared to defy a system that had long relegated them to the margins. At school, the hallways were charged with an electricity that wasn't entirely celebratory. The buzz of voices was sharp, interspersed with a dissonant note of resentment. Elijah's teacher, Mr. Daniels, had prepared the class for an important assembly, a gathering meant to celebrate community spirit, but which, in the subtle undercurrents of everyday America, had morphed into something far more complex and fraught with tension. As he took his seat in the crowded auditorium, he could feel eyes on him, some gleaming with admiration, others dark with unspoken contempt. The assembly began with speeches that were carefully constructed to invoke unity, a rhetoric that sounded sweet, yet carried the faint odor of patronization. Then, as the speaker mentioned Elijah's recent act of kindness at the stadium, the tone shifted. A murmur rippled through the room. What had begun as quiet applause, a respectful nod to an innocent gesture, soon turned into a contentious debate among those whose voices had long been stifled by systemic prejudice. "Is this really about compassion?" a gruff voice asked from the back, its tone edged with cynicism. "Or is it just another way to pat ourselves on the back while keeping us in our place?" The question was not new. It was the same inquiry that had echoed from generation to generation in kitchens, bus stops, and community centers across the city. But today, it cut sharper, as if the past had come roaring into the present with renewed fury. Elijah's throat tightened. His act, a moment of genuine kindness, had been twisted into a symbol, a currency in a marketplace where the worth of a black boy's decency was constantly under debate. His heart pounded as he listened, his thoughts a tumult of pride and hurt. In that charged atmosphere, every word felt like a blow. each syllable a reminder that the simple act of giving up a seat had become a battleground for an entire history of injustice. After the assembly, as the students spilled out into the corridor, the tension did not dissipate, it thickened. A small group of older boys, their expressions etched with the scars of a lifelong struggle for recognition, cornered him by the lockers. Their voices were low, but laden with a hostility that belied their age. "Think you're some kind of hero now? Huh?" one sneered, the sound bitter and raw. "You gave up a seat and suddenly you're breaking the chains? What chains, boy? Your chains are the ones you let hang around you every day." Elijah's eyes stung with tears he refused to shed in public. The words, harsh as they were, came not only from peers but from those who had been forced to accept a lifetime of indignity. Their anger was not purely personal, it was the accumulated frustration of countless souls who had watched the world offer promises of equality that never came to fruition. Their words were a challenge, a reminder that while a single act of kindness could illuminate a moment, it could never erase the deep-rooted wounds of systemic racism. Later that afternoon, as Elijah walked home through streets shadowed by the memories of protests and marches, he passed by a mural painted decades ago, a vibrant yet worn testament to the civil rights movement. The faces depicted on the wall, resolute and hopeful, seemed to watch him with knowing eyes. In that moment, he felt both uplifted and burdened by the legacy he carried. Every step was a negotiation between the past and the present, a fragile dance on the edge of hope and despair. At home, his mother Lorraine waited by the door, her tired eyes softening as she saw him approach. Over a humble dinner in their cramped kitchen, the conversation turned, as it always did, to the cost of standing up in a world so indifferent to change. "They're using your name now, Elijah," she said quietly, her voice trembling with both pride and sorrow. "Your kindness is being paraded as a token, an example to be exploited, rather than a sign of genuine human connection." Her words cut through him. He felt the weight of every unspoken expectation, every burden of history that pressed upon him like an unyielding tide. He knew that his life was no longer a series of isolated moments, it had become part of a larger narrative. One written in the ink of systemic injustice and personal sacrifice. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight and the city outside slumbered under a blanket of uneasy quiet, Elijah lay awake on his bed. The silence was heavy with the unspoken stories of those who had come before him, of fathers and mothers who had dared to dream in a world that too often crushed their aspirations. His mind raced with thoughts of tomorrow, of the challenges that lay ahead. The simple act of giving up a seat had ignited a spark. And now he was caught in a wildfire of expectation and resistance. A conflagration fueled by decades of pain and hope. In the stillness of that dark room, Elijah vowed that he would not allow his spirit to be broken by a society unwilling to change. Though the path ahead was riddled with trials, hostile glances, harsh words, and the relentless pressure of history, he would carry within him the light of his own quiet revolution. For in every act of genuine kindness, in every step taken against the current of prejudice, there lay the possibility of transformation. The promise that even the smallest spark could one day illuminate the darkest corners of an enduring legacy. That Wednesday morning, as Elijah set out for school beneath a sky bruised with heavy clouds, the air itself seemed charged with the promise of upheaval. The streets, etched with memories of struggle and silent protests, bore witness to a city that had long learned to live with the tension of its past. Yet now, the simmering discontent was no longer a distant murmur, it was a palpable storm gathering at the horizon of every step he took. In the schoolyard, as students milled about in clusters, the atmosphere was thick with a mix of anxious expectation and the raw pain of old wounds reopened. Elijah's arrival was met by a mixture of wary glances and hushed comments. Some of the older students, those who had witnessed decades of the same battles, murmured to one another, their voices low, as though discussing a sacred yet dangerous truth. The act of kindness that had set his life in motion was no longer viewed as an isolated event. Instead, it had become a lightning rod, electrifying every conversation with the unspoken acknowledgement of a society still steeped in racial divisions. In class, Mr. Daniels began a lecture on the history of civil rights, a subject that, for the elder generation listening, was as real as the scars on their hands and as vivid as the memories of protest chants echoing down long-forgotten streets. As Mr. Daniels spoke, his words, measured and impassioned, cut through the mundane drone of the lesson. He spoke of the sacrifices made by those who had dared to challenge injustice, of the heavy cost borne by generations who were forced to fight for the dignity of their very existence. Elijah sat quietly, absorbing every word, yet feeling the weight of expectation settle on his young shoulders like a burden he had not chosen. After school, the tension reached a fevered pitch. As Elijah walked home along a boulevard lined with shuttered storefronts and faded murals, he was accosted by a group of local men, their faces lined with the hardships of a long struggle against a system that had repeatedly denied them respect. Their voices, low and laced with both bitterness and sorrow, converged on him in a harsh cadence. "Boy, you think you're changing the world by giving up a seat?" one of them demanded. His tone part challenge and part lament. "That's not how it works out here. Our world, it's built on pain and sacrifice, not on your small acts of virtue." Elijah's pulse raced, and for a moment he could only stand silent, his eyes wide with the realization that his single gesture had become entangled in a web of collective memory, a symbol for both hope and for a deep-seated frustration born of generations marginalized by prejudice. The men's words, heavy with the legacy of injustice, were not meant solely to scorn him. They were a cry against a system that had repeatedly silenced the voices of the oppressed. A reminder that even the purest intentions could be twisted into something that served as a reminder of enduring inequity. In the aftermath of that encounter, Elijah's home became a refuge and a crucible for his thoughts. His mother, Lorraine, sat with him at the worn kitchen table, her eyes reflecting decades of experience, a mix of fierce pride and aching resignation. "You see, Elijah," she said softly, "this isn't just about a seat. It's about every day that our community is reminded that our humanity is measured against a standard that was never meant for us. They use our kindness as both a beacon and a barometer of what they think we should be." Her words resonated deeply, igniting a fire of determination in Elijah even as they stoked the embers of disillusionment. In that small kitchen, surrounded by the weight of their shared history, he vowed silently that his path forward would be one of both courage and careful resistance. Later that evening, as the first drops of rain began to tap against the window panes, each droplet a muted percussion in the growing storm, Elijah received an unexpected call. It was from the local community center, inviting him to a town meeting that promised to address the very issues that had been twisting through the veins of the neighborhood for far too long. The meeting, they explained, was intended to forge new paths for unity, but to many in the community, it also threatened to expose the raw, unhealed scars of decades past. That night, as he lay awake in the dim light of his bedroom, Elijah's mind churned with the echoes of the day, the hostile words on the street, the heavy lessons in the classroom, and his mother's measured counsel. In the silence, punctuated by the distant roll of thunder, he realized that the storm gathering outside was not merely a meteorological event, it was the culmination of every injustice, every denial, and every suppressed cry for recognition that had ever been uttered in his community. With the coming day promising the confrontation of truths that had long been buried, Elijah braced himself for what lay ahead. Every challenge, every sharp word, every subtle sneer was part of a relentless struggle, a struggle not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of every soul who had ever been made to feel less than human. And though the road ahead was fraught with tension and pain, the promise of change, however small, shimmered in the distance like a fragile beacon amid the encroaching dark. In that moment, Elijah knew that his journey was no longer just about reclaiming a seat or a moment of kindness. It was about standing at the storm's edge, facing the fury of a world steeped in its own contradictions, and daring to believe that even the smallest spark of genuine humanity could light the way to a future where every person was seen, valued, and free. The night after the town meeting, when the rain had ceased but the air still trembled with the residue of conflict, Elijah lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of a city that had not yet learned to heal. In the hours before dawn, when even the restless dreams of the oppressed were laid bare, he felt a deep, searing awareness that everything was about to change. The gentle promise of kindness, which had once glimmered so purely, now revealed itself as a bird and a banner that marked him as both a symbol and a target in a society that had never truly let go of its prejudices. That morning, the sky was a heavy slate. And as Elijah walked to school, every footstep seemed to echo against the walls of history. He recalled the images from the meeting. Voices raised in both hope and accusation. Faces old with memories of struggle. And eyes that carried an unspoken litany of past injustices. For the first time, the simple act of giving up his seat the moment that had ignited this cascade of consequences was no longer a private deed. It had been distilled into a narrative that others would use to measure their own worth. To remind themselves of a world that was forever divided by skin and circumstance. At school, the tension was palpable. The assembly hall, already heavy with the weight of expectation, now crackled with a charged urgency. Mr. Daniels's lecture that day was not merely a recounting of historical events but an invocation, a call to remember that every act of kindness was an act of rebellion against an ingrained system of segregation. As Mr. Daniels spoke, his voice rose and fell like the cadence of an old spiritual. A reminder that the struggle for dignity was as alive as the wounds that scarred the nation's soul. Elijah sat at his desk, heart pounding, as the teacher's words seemed to set the room ablaze with memory and possibility. But the discussion soon turned contentious. A classmate, emboldened by the heated atmosphere, stood abruptly, voice quivering with both anger and despair. "You think your simple act can change anything?" he demanded. "It's just one seat, one gesture. You don't know what it's like. Living every day as if you're invisible to those who hold power." The words struck Elijah like a thunderclap. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the relentless tapping of rain against the window. The challenge was not aimed solely at him, it was aimed at a system that had rendered him perpetually peripheral. In that charged silence, every heart in the room seemed to beat with a question. Can one young man's quiet defiance ever pierce the dense veil of racism that had defined their lives for generations? After school, as the hallways emptied and the fluorescent lights flickered on in a reluctant farewell, Elijah found himself swept into the city's embrace. The bus ride home was a blur of faces etched with years of hardship. Eyes that spoke of both resigned sorrow and a fierce, unyielding desire for change. He stared out at the passing neighborhood streets lined with modest homes that bore silent witness to countless untold stories of triumph and betrayal, and felt that he, too, was now part of that endless narrative. That evening, an urgent knock shattered the fragile calm of his modest apartment. Standing at the door was Mr. Henderson, whose weathered face and steady gaze had long provided a silent comfort to the community. "Elijah," he said quietly, stepping into the room as if drawn by an unspoken need to share his burden. "There's been another incident downtown. A young man, much like yourself, was harassed for simply walking where he belonged. The police were called, and the whole thing has become a spectacle." Mr. Henderson's words landed with the force of a sledgehammer, shattering any lingering illusions that individual acts of decency could exist apart from a wider storm of cruelty. Elijah's mother, Lorraine, joined them at the table, her eyes hard and tired as she spoke. "This is what we've been living with, day in and day out," she murmured. "Our kindness is constantly under assault, questioned, and exploited. Every act you perform is met with suspicion or used against you. It's as if our very humanity is a liability in this country." The room seemed to shrink around them as the harsh reality pressed in. For hours, they talked in low, urgent tones of history, of the wounds that would never fully heal, of a future that seemed as elusive as a distant dream. The conversation moved from recollections of past injustices to the stark, immediate threat of the present. Each word, each pause, resonated with the tension of a society struggling to reconcile its promises with its practices. Later that night, as Elijah lay on his threadbare mattress, the echoes of the day refused to let him rest. Outside, the city's hum was punctuated by distant sirens and the murmur of discontent. A symphony of a community on the brink. In that suffocating darkness, every face he had seen, the pride and the pain, the hope and the hostility flashed before his eyes. He felt that the small, isolated act of relinquishing a seat had now woven itself into the very fabric of a struggle that was much larger than he had ever imagined. And then, in the silence of those heavy hours, a resolve began to crystallize within him. No longer would he allow his quiet compassion to be transformed into a weapon against him. Instead, he would claim it as his own, a personal beacon in a world where the light of dignity was too often dimmed by prejudice. He would speak out, not just for himself, but for all those who had been silenced by a system that measured their worth by the color of their skin. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of tentative gold and crimson, Elijah rose with a fierce determination. He understood now that the road ahead was fraught with peril and that every step would be a battle against the shadows of racism that had long haunted his community. But he also knew that within him burned an unyielding flame, a spark of humanity that, if nurtured, could one day ignite a revolution of hearts and minds. With that thought, Elijah stepped out into the new day. Every stride was a defiant act. Every breath a promise to himself and to those who had come before him. In the relentless cadence of his footsteps, in the echo of his resolve, lay the truth that even in the face of an unyielding storm, the human spirit could still rise, and in rising, could shatter the chains of silence that had bound it for far too long. As the days bled into one another, the relentless drum of injustice began to soften at last, replaced by a trembling hope that even the most scarred earth might one day yield new life. That morning, the sun rose over a city still bruised by conflict and hardened by a legacy of segregation, but also whispered of possibility. Elijah awoke with a quiet determination, each moment a defiant beat against a history that had long dictated who could sit, speak, or dream. The streets, once a theater for whispered insults and cautious glances, now pulsed with an energy that felt both fragile and fierce. Neighbors, many of whom had weathered decades of exclusion, gathered at the community center, a modest building that had once been a relic of neglected promises. Today, it was reborn as a forum for voices too long muted. The air was charged, not with the bitter cadence of disdain, but with the hopeful murmur of shared purpose. Elijah stepped forward into the open courtyard, his eyes tracing the faces of those assembled elderly residents whose lives had been steeped in the memory of struggle. Their skin and souls marked by the passage of time and the scars of prejudice. They had come not as spectators, but as active participants in the labor of reclaiming their dignity. The murmurs of conversation grew into a chorus of resolve as the meeting commenced. A respected elder, Mrs. Beauregard, her voice soft yet imbued with the weight of many lost battles, took the stage. "We have lived through a century of pain," she intoned, her eyes glistening with the wisdom of survival. "And yet we find ourselves here, gathered to rewrite the story. No longer shall our worth be measured by the color of our skin, but by the content of our hearts and the strength of our community." Her words, though simple, cascaded through the room like a long-awaited rain, washing over the assembly with an undeniable promise of renewal. As she spoke, Elijah recalled the torrent of hostility he had endured, the sneering voices in school corridors, the bitter glares in shadowed alleys, the crushing weight of a society that had long relegated his kindness to a mere symbol of its own contradictions. Today, however, he was not alone in that pain. He was joined by a multitude of souls who had learned, often at great personal cost, that resilience was born in the crucible of suffering. In that charged atmosphere, the tension that had once threatened to crush his spirit transformed into a fierce clarity. Elijah's mind, brimming with memories of the harsh words and brutal indifference he had encountered, found its voice in the rising clamor of the community. He approached the microphone with a tentative, yet resolute, step. His voice, when it emerged, was not quivering with fear but resonated with the steady cadence of truth. "I once gave up my seat because I believed that kindness could bridge a divide, a small act in a vast, divided country," he began, each word unfolding with a deliberate, measured pace that belied the storm of emotion within. "But I have learned that even the kindest act can be contorted by a world that measures its worth in prejudice. Today, I stand before you not as a hero, but as a fellow traveler on this hard road. Our lives have been shattered by the very system that should have protected us. Yet in our shared pain, we find the strength to rise again." A murmur of agreement swept through the hall. Faces that had once been etched with resignation now shone with the fierce glimmer of possibility. In the murmur of voices older than time, Elijah sensed the convergence of history and hope, a unity that transcended individual suffering to embrace the collective yearning for change. Outside, the sky, once a slate of oppressive gray, began to break with hints of orange and gold. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, as if nature itself was marking the end of an era and the tentative beginning of a new dawn. In that moment, the community's resolve crystallized into action. Plans were whispered for new programs, educational workshops, community gardens, safe spaces for the youth, and promises were made to fight the lingering inequities that had long festered beneath the surface. Yet, as the meeting drew to a close and the congregation slowly dispersed into the cool evening air, a residual tension lingered, a reminder that while hope had been kindled, the battle against systemic racism was far from over. The challenges ahead were steeped in decades of neglect and cruelty, and the struggle for true equality would demand sacrifices that none could predict. Elijah stepped out into the gathering dusk, the gentle hum of the city now imbued with a palpable sense of purpose. Each step he took was heavy with the weight of history, yet lightened by the promise of a future that, despite its uncertainties, shone with the possibility of transformation. In the quiet spaces between the heartbeats of that determined march forward, he knew that the legacy of suffering could, at last, give way to a legacy of courage, a legacy that might one day reclaim every discarded seat, every whispered insult, every moment of despair, and transform it into a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. For in the rising dawn, amid the ashes of a fractured past, there lay the quiet, indomitable promise that every small act of kindness, every step taken in defiance of hatred, could light the way toward a world reborn, a world where dignity, hope, and love would finally triumph over the long shadows of discrimination.